Hi guys, welcome. So this is the fourth week of our little lecturette series, and this is the last week. So in the first 3 weeks, we've looked at effective writing, motivation, purpose and audience, and the standard paper. This week, we're looking at abstracts, communicating outcomes, hook, line and sinker. Now I'm really hoping you know what that means. If you're a fisherman, you have a hook on the end of your line and you have a weight, a sinker to make it go down. And the usual interpretation, the colloquial interpretation of hook, line and sinker is actually complete belief. People believe it completely, that they go with it. Our pattern for this week is fairly familiar. We'll do our last little trawl through the verbs, then abstracts, summaries of motivation, outcomes and outlook. Then, maybe surprisingly, we're going to do just a tiny bit on writing for the public as a scientist. So this is the extreme audience that you might have to write for. You'll normally be writing for scientists, but the public are not scientists. And writing policy as a scientist, not sure if we'll get there, but in the sense it may dilute the other material beforehand. You need to have read Unit 2 again for this session, or for this lecturette. We haven't got many verbs left. How to write an abstract of the work. As you'll see, we'll also be looking at some of the previous things we've thought about as well. Okay, so let's start where we left off, I suppose. Although you may not think of it this way, the abstract is probably the most important part of your paper. Now, depending on how you think about it, you write it first and then rewrite it, or actually you write it last. There are two schools of thought on this. I tend to be a write my abstract in bullet points, sort of that sort of bunny, and then write it properly at the end. But I know other colleagues who write it properly at the beginning and then write the whole paper to deliver that. 6 of one, half dozen of the other. But why is it the most important part of what you write? Because often, I can't say this politely, it's the only part of it that's ever read. If after reading the abstract, your reader is not desperately enthralled, or it doesn't quite press their buttons or whatever, it's maybe the only part of your paper they'll read. If you think about it, if you're submitting a paper to a journal, the editor will read the abstract. I'm a journal editor, and I'll read the abstract, and I try to be a bit more thorough than that. I'll also read other parts of the paper, but I know many of my colleagues don't. If the abstract doesn't persuade, then basically most of us have many more papers than we can publish. Therefore, it goes on the big pile, which is not the pile you want to be in. Equally, your peers. I don't wish to be cynical, but when I'm doing a literature search, I'm hunting through, I'll read the abstract, and that will determine whether I download the paper or just print the abstract. Therefore, the abstract has to lead your reader into your work. It must ignite curiosity in your work. Bluntly, it must have a hook. And if we stick with hook, line and sinker, the hook is the bit where the poor old fish bites and can't get off it. Well, I don't fish, but I always feel sorry for the fish in this particular scenario. You need a hook for your reader. Okay, so conventionally, what should the abstract contain? Well, you know this already. I always translate it as what we did, why we did it, what we found, and what it means. I think that describes fairly, for me anyway, succinctly what an abstract is. A bit later, we'll recognise that different areas have different types of abstract, but for a science abstract, this is pretty much what we're looking at. Right, so what must your abstract do? The readers of scientific papers usually read the abstract for two purposes. The first is to decide, rather like me, whether they want to read the full paper or not, or whether the abstract will do, or whether in fact, oh my God, this is not anything I want to read at all. And secondly, to prepare themselves for the details presented in that paper. Now, ultimately, your career aim, before any others, will be to influence your readers. Remember your purpose, that is what you want your audience to do. You will want in your area to become influential, a so-called thought leader, so that when people hear your name or see your face, they think, ah, that's the guy that ... and they want to talk to you, or they want to discuss something with you. So your aim as a scientist should be to become a thought leader in your area. Your abstract needs to convince your readers that they want to read some more. They want to read your paper. So let's ask the obvious question. What are your readers primarily interested in? What do they want to know most of all out of your paper? Well, you'll be unsurprised to know there's been quite a lot of work done addressed to those questions. And the primary interest of a reader is the motivation and the outcome. These are what your reader is interested in. The introduction, they want to know about the motivation, and they want to know about the conclusions, the outcomes. So, given that that's what your reader wants, and given that they won't get anywhere near there if your abstract doesn't at least answer some of these questions for your reader. Remember, the aim is to help your reader. The aim is to give your reader what they want. So they're happy, they're excited, they're interested, they're engaged, they're on the hook. Okay. And to follow the analogy further, once they're on the hook, you can start reeling them in. But anyway, given this, you can think of your abstract as having two distinct parts. One of them we'll call motivation, and one of them we'll call outcome. Pretty much the same sort of structure as your introduction. If this is our broad list of what our abstract is, what we did, why we did it, what we found and what it means, then obviously the what we did and the why we did it is a bit of context and its motivation. What we found and what it means are effectively outcomes. Now, unlike the introduction, even though you're going to follow a similar structure to the introduction section, your reader is different. So you're going to state the context, the need, the task, and the object of the document, much as you did in the introduction. But of course, you've maybe got 200 words, and your reader is definitely different. With your abstract, you've got potentially all of them. Whoever is like to read your paper is like to read your abstract, from the least specialized to the most specialized. Whereas with the intro and the conclusions, by that time, you've either hooked them and they read the paper, or they've never got there. They read your abstract and you didn't hook them. So, thinking about our abstract structure, the first part here, the what we did and why we did it, it's the context, it's the need, it's the task and the object, what the paper's about. And the two other parts, the what we found and what it means. The outcomes are the findings, the conclusions, and the perspectives. This is where, as we looked in the last lecture, that Watson and Lovelock actually developed, this is why this is important. If you like, the first part is the what, and the second part is the message, the so what. Okay, so moving on. We're going to look at some examples in a moment, but because it's potentially the only thing your reader is going to read, I hope not. I hope that your abstract is so gripping that they read the whole paper straight off. But the sad fact is, or the stats are, that probably won't be the case for every paper you write. Anyway, an effective abstract therefore has to stand on its own. It must be able to be understood fully, even when the full paper is not there. So there's a few rules that come from that. Avoid referring to figures or references or bibliography in your abstract. And if you're going to use acronyms, and here is a warning, too many acronyms make the thing unreadable, but if you're going to introduce any acronyms, the first time you use them, define them in the abstract, and then later on define them again in the full paper. So bearing in mind, it's what we did and why we did it, and then what we found, it's in the past tense. And it's got to be good. You have to hook your reader, you have to ignite their curiosity. So let's look at a couple of examples. And remember, the challenge here is maybe 200, 250 words. Here is an abstract. And remember our introduction type structure? That's here. The context, the basis, that effectively marine organisms strongly influence climate processes. The need, what we have and what we want. What science has, analysis of a satellite-derived phytoplankton concentration, since 1979, have suggested decadal fluctuations linked to climate forcing, but the length of this record is insufficient to resolve longer-term trends. Okay, that's where we are, that's what we've got. What do we want? To estimate the time dependence of phytoplankton biomass since the beginning of the oceanographic measurements in 1899. What have we done? What's the task? We combined the available ocean transparency measurements and in situ chlorophyll observations. And what's the object of the paper? This paper presents the trends we identified at local, regional and global levels. Okay, as it happens, part of my misspent youth as a postdoc was on research vessels. I was measuring atmospheric species, but invariably I was helping the biologists measuring chlorophyll and God knows what. So this not only meets the first part of the structure we were talking about, but actually it's worked. For me, I'm hooked. I'm interested. This actually looks like we can answer a question that we have. We can move our knowledge forward. What did they find? And this is a very positive finding in that sense. 8 out of 10 ocean regions, actually maybe a decline of 1% per year. And the conclusions and the perspective, the implications, if you will. So this is very, very well written, actually stylish. I guess it's nature, so you can expect high quality there. But it's got everything it needs. It's got the type of structure you want. The hook is there, and if I'm the fish, I'm hooked. I would read the rest of this paper. And hopefully, for all of your papers, all of your readers will come to that conclusion. But that won't happen if you don't do anything. This is why you've got this course. Okay, so I'm going to cover something else now because I found, particularly in Singapore, that seniors are really important. In fact, seniors are so important that certainly with many modules, I find that students listen to their seniors more than they listen to their professors. Silly example, I radically changed the third year practicals a few years ago, and for a semester or two I still had people handing in practicals that weren't running that year, but they had run the previous 5 years or something like that. So not all abstracts are the same, and often seniors, though very useful, they will have particular things in their head and won't necessarily understand what you're doing. But let's look at this. I've stolen this from the University of Wisconsin, and I recommend this site to you. This is an abstract of the biogeography of chemical defense in birch trees. And what I've done is I've colored the text to show the different parts. So the first part in black, here's the context. And actually it's also what science knows at the moment. Here's the what we want in green. Here's the task in yellow, what we did. And this abstract is slightly different because there aren't any results here. This looks like the sort of abstract you put in for a conference. So it talks about what the research hopefully will do or will show. So it's wider context, but there doesn't happen to be any results. So this is fine. This is a science abstract. But maybe your senior has been playing in a different pond. Maybe he's talking about social science. Now this is a typical social science abstract. Now it's full of good things, and the last part of the abstract is we are finding that sport video games support learning. We hope to find out how one learns about oneself as a learner from playing. It's great, but it's not the same structure as a science abstract. I'm only going to do one more of these. A service abstract, like a project, a lottery project or government project. This is about an education program for young teen parents, and the end again is quite similar to a science end maybe. The participants walked away from the program with a sense of hope that they're able to pursue their dreams despite their difficult situations. But again, there's not too much in common here with a standard science type abstract. Okay, I think I've talked about abstracts quite enough. Go for a science abstract along the pattern that I've showed you. Please don't wander off into some other area, because your abstract will be less functional, it will be less efficient, and it won't meet your purpose as well. I'm actually not straying very far from the subject, but I'm going to talk a bit about writing for the public as a scientist. I'm actually, well, as you'll see, although it looks like I'm moving further away, I'm not straying very far from abstracts. But we're going to talk a bit about writing for the public as a scientist. So now you are not writing for scientists. You're writing for Joe Public, Uncle Joe Cobley, the works, and his dog. In this section, I've stolen stuff from various sites, and I've stolen this material here from Science, and I've given you the reference there. Scientists tend to come across to the public as competent, but cold. And it's generally thought that if they can perceive to be a little warmer, that helps them build trust in their reader and encourage their reader to read what they write. If you're writing for the public, you have to use a rather different approach than you would for a scientific journal. If you like, when you write a paper, you are the authority. So you write authoritatively, not as a bigot, but unemotionally and authoritative, because that's how we write. It's not usually appropriate to do that when you're communicating with a general audience. People do not like to feel that they are back in school. And remember what we've talked about, when your audience is generalist, you have to fill certain information in for them, but they don't like to feel they're being lectured. They don't like to feel that they've suddenly gone back 20 years and they're in a classroom again. So all the lessons you've learnt about a broad audience apply here in spades. That means a lot. So let's now think about the hook. You're writing for the general public. What's the hook? How do you get them to bite? The temptation as a scientist is to start with something like broader impact statements or a foundational concept in the field, like you would in a journal article. If you tell general public readers something they already know in the first sentence, they're likely to think you've got nothing to say they don't already know. There's something here which actually applies to scientists and the public, but sometimes it applies to the public more. People don't always know what they don't know, or they don't understand what they don't understand. And that's the most difficult one. It's fine if Mr. Joe Public knows he understands, calibration, and knows he doesn't understand limits of quantification. Fine. That's a dream. That's a fairy godmother scenario. But when Joe Public doesn't even know what calibration is, no idea why it's important, and doesn't know that he doesn't know that, he sees no reason for it, then you're in a more difficult situation. The answer, and again, it's an answer you've seen before in the previous lecture. Your introduction should get to the point very quickly and offer a clear and interesting statement of your thesis or what your article is about. A guide to the rest of the article, but in the first few lines. And this will act as your hook if it's interesting enough. It can be a picture, and I'm going to show you an example of that in a moment. So you hook them in the first few lines, or you don't hook them at all. So this is clearly a very different proposition, a very different writing proposition to writing a paper. I know there is still the interest in the paper, but you have a lot more things playing for you if you're writing to scientists. If you're writing for the public, they've got other things they can do. They can go and eat popcorn, they can go watch a film, they can do anything else. Why would they read what you've written? I don't want to stray into science journalism here, but there's some very interesting and very useful material in that field. And I think in the first lecture, I quoted the either Nature, Science or Guardian science journalism stuff. Some interesting material. As a scientist, you are going to need to do some of this stuff, whether it's outreach or being an advocate for science. So you do need to learn this skill. You may not need to learn it quite now. That's why this is only 5 minutes in a lecture. Okay, that was the hook. It's hook, line and sinker. This is the line. And you've actually, you know this already. It's a journey. It's one step after the other. So each of your paragraphs need to introduce a new idea with a topic sentence. Effective transitions between these paragraphs. You need to assemble your thought journey for your audience with very little or no disciplinal content. And you might say, whoa, hold on just a moment there, baby. I'm a whatever chemist, but I've not made a mistake with no or very little disciplinal content. Much less detailed information, but an accurate portrayal of what was done and the implications of what was done. Again, motivation and conclusions. And the sinker is, of course, that they keep reading. Now, let's look at just one example. So what follows are two articles, one produced for the public and one is a Nature article actually. So it's still very high quality, very accessible, but it's actually aimed more at scientists. This is the article. Batteries not included, meet Octobot, the first entirely soft autonomous robot. That's the headline. The strapline, the robot is powered by chemical reactions and can run for up to 8 minutes. And we have a picture, which is quite an interesting little picture. Meet the Octobot, the first robot to be made entirely from soft materials, powered by a chemical reaction and controlled by a fluidic logic circuit. It heralds a generation of soft robots that might surpass conventional machines. Very little real detail. This came out of Harvard. So this is from the Harvard website. So it's designed for public consumption. But you get the picture, and you literally get a picture. That's a hook. Looks like an octopus. Yeah, it's artificial. So the hook is the picture and the words. You've not got too much detail, but you've got enough to know that this is really quite important. And it's actually quite interesting. We don't want to go around making octopi, I should say, but nonetheless, this is an interesting idea. Now, let's look at the Nature paper this came from. I'm not going to read this. It's still very high quality, actually, but it's probably getting a bit too detailed for most of the general public. There's more context here, and there's more why this is important. Soft robots possess many attributes that are difficult, if not impossible, to achieve with conventional robots composed of rigid materials. Yet despite recent advances, soft robots must still be tethered to a hard robotic control systems and power sources. So a bit of context, and that is what we've got. New strategies for creating completely soft robots, including new soft analogues of these crucial components, are needed to realise their full potential. That's what we need. So we've got context, what we've got, what we need. And here we go. Here we report the untethered operation, blah, 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 and a lot more detail reference. But still, the picture is a big draw. You can use a picture to do this. A picture paints 1,000 words. It's never been truer. So it's still good writing, and actually, it's actually fairly open writing. An educated member of the general public could follow most of it. But there's a lot more detail. There's a lot more introduction, more of the abstract content that we would expect in a science paper, because it's a Nature paper. Okay. I think I've said most of what I want to say. All writing, but particularly abstracts, and public writing and policy writing, although I haven't really talked about that, require absolute clarity and an idea of the shape of the human psychology which governs interest. So we know now what people are looking for. That's the shape of the human psychology which governs their interest, and we write for it. Remember, we're always trying to help the reader. So it's always motivation, it's always outcome, and all those other 1,000 rules about old information before new, simple words, not complicated, simple sentences, linked sentences, paragraphs, the sort of stuff we did in the first lecture. I come back to Admiral Rickover. Your paper is a journey. Each sentence is a step. Each paragraph is a thought. if you design your abstract, your paper along these lines, bearing in mind the other stuff that we talked about, actually, you've got a reasonable chance that they'll read your paper and not just give up during the abstract. Okay, as I said, that's probably all I want to say. So that's the end of this little job. So yeah, take care. Bye bye.